Emma Reynolds thought she was celebrating her 35th birthday. Instead, she found herself blindfolded and abandoned at a desolate gas station by the man she had called her husband for 12 years. Behind the scenes, Jack Reynolds and his friends were laughing, thinking it was just a prank to push her into a divorce. But what none of them knew was that Emma had overheard every detail of their plan. And she wasn't going to wait around to be discarded. With nothing but a hidden roll of cash, a fake name, and a mind sharper than anyone realized, she vanished into the heart of Paris, into anonymity, into a life entirely her own. What followed wasn't just escape. It was transformation. What happens when the woman they thought was weak becomes the one writing the rules? Where are you watching this video from right now? Drop a comment below. And get ready, because this story will pull you in and never let go. Gravel crunched under my shoes as I stepped out of the car, blindfolded, heart pounding, my pulse drumming louder than the laughter still echoing from the vehicle behind me. The scent of old gasoline and rust hung in the dry air. Somewhere behind me I heard the car doors slam shut and the engine rev to life. "Happy birthday, Emma." Jack's voice called, laced with mockery. Then the sound of tires peeling away. Silence followed. Absolute and deafening. I stood frozen, the silk scarf still tied tight around my eyes. I had counted 47 minutes since we left the house. Enough time to be completely disoriented. But I wasn't. I had memorized every second of the route during my weeks of preparation. I waited a full minute after the laughter faded, then untied the scarf and let it drop to the ground. The gas station was even more desolate than I had pictured. A shattered storefront, rusted pumps like skeletons, cigarette ads from the early 2000s flapping in the wind. They thought this would break me. They thought this would be the final humiliating straw. One last prank before Jack served me divorce papers, probably expecting I'd crumble, beg, accept whatever terms he handed down. But what they didn't know was that I had heard everything. 3 nights ago, crouched under the dining room window while Jack and his mistress Phoebe toasted to getting rid of the boring wife, I had made a decision. This wasn't a surprise for me. It was my escape plan executed perfectly. I walked briskly around the back of the building where I would be hidden from the road, slipped off my right boot, and pulled out the emergency cash I had wrapped in plastic and shoved deep into the sole. $800. Enough for the first leg of my journey. From my oversized purse, I pulled out a pair of jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a baseball cap. I stripped quickly, not caring about the dust or the faint sting of anxiety in my chest. My birthday dress was symbolic. One last costume from the role I had just abandoned. 12 minutes. That's how long I had until the Uber arrived. I checked my watch and waited behind the building, shielded from view, heart slowing, breath steadying. The driver pulled up in a dusty blue sedan, looking confused and a little uneasy. "Mrs. Carter?" he called, using the alias I had booked under. "Yes," I replied with a polite wave. "Thanks for coming all the way out here." He glanced at the rundown station and nodded, uneasy but silent. "Where to?" he asked once I was inside. "Marston Pond downtown," I said. He gave a short nod and drove. My hands trembled slightly as we headed back toward the city. But not from fear. From the thrill of something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. When we pulled up to the pawn shop, I stepped out and thanked the driver. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. The interior smelled of old wood and metal polish. Behind the counter stood an older man with silver hair and worn eyes. "What can I help you with today?" he asked. I laid my grandmother's pearl necklace, my engagement ring, my wedding band, and the emerald earrings Jack had given me for our 10th anniversary onto the glass counter. "I need to know what these are worth." He didn't pry. Just examined them in silence, then looked up at me. "I can offer you $7,000, he said gently. "It's a fair price." I nodded, swallowing the tight lump in my throat. "I'll take it." He stepped into the back and returned a moment later, not just with cash but with something else. A small handgun in a case. "I don't usually do this," he said softly. "But you look like someone starting over. You'll want protection." I stared at the weapon, speechless. "It's legal and registered. Consider it a discount on the jewelry." "Thank you," I whispered. He gave me a sad, knowing smile. "Good luck wherever you're headed." I slipped the cash and the gun into my bag. The next stop was the bus station. I bought a one-way ticket to New York City, the overnight route. It would get me there in time for my international flight. I sat at the far end of the waiting area, baseball cap pulled low, eyes watching every entrance. A flicker of fear still lived in me, that Jack might have second thoughts that he'd come back. But as the minutes turned to hours and the bus pulled into the station, I realized something undeniable. No one was coming to save me. No one was chasing me either. I was entirely, terrifyingly, blessedly free. I stepped onto the bus as the sun dipped below the horizon. I didn't look back. I wouldn't again. I was done being the joke in someone else's story. From that starting point I headed toward the city. And a different kind of past, one I would choose to rewrite myself. The overnight bus swayed as it rolled through sleeping suburbs and industrial outskirts. I sat in the back corner, arms folded tightly over the duffel bag that now held everything I hadn't left behind. The hum of the engine became a lullaby, masking the sharp edge of my thoughts. Around me strangers dozed, unaware that I wasn't just traveling, I was vanishing. As the skyline of New York City emerged through the window just before dawn, I closed my eyes for a moment longer, knowing that the moment I stepped off that bus, my old life would dissolve completely. The air outside was cold and damp. I hailed a cab, gave the driver the name of a pawn shop I had researched weeks before, and leaned back against the seat as we wove through unfamiliar streets. When the cab pulled up outside a narrow storefront in Lower Manhattan, I paid in cash and entered without hesitation. The interior smelled faintly of tobacco and varnish, a space frozen in time. Behind the counter stood a man with clouded eyes and liver-spotted hands. He glanced up from his newspaper and gave me a slow nod. Without a word, I placed a second small pouch on the counter, hidden heirlooms I hadn't dared to show before. A sapphire brooch from my mother's jewelry box, a gold locket containing a photo of my late father, and the bracelet Jack had once given me as a peace offering after our first real fight. The man's hands moved methodically as he examined each piece. "You're selling memories," he murmured. I met his eyes, steady. "I'm buying a future." He didn't ask questions. 10 grand. That's what I can offer. I nodded. Outside, the city was beginning to wake. I ducked into a nearby alley and opened the burner phone I had purchased under a false identity. One new message blinked on the screen. Flight confirmed. 9:15 a.m. Paris via Reykjavik. I deleted it immediately. At the airport, I passed through security using my passport under the name Emily Carter. Paid in full with cash through a discreet travel agent who asked no questions. The TSA agent barely glanced at my documents. I moved through the terminal as if I belonged. My heart pounded not with fear but with clarity. Everything was happening exactly as I had planned. In the waiting area, I sat by the window and watched the planes taxi and lift off, each one carrying stories. Some returning, some running. I didn't dwell on what Jack might be doing at that very moment. If the plan had worked, he would just now be waking up, possibly hungover, maybe laughing. Maybe realizing I hadn't come home. I imagined him scrolling his phone, seeing no text from me. I imagined him calling my name in the hallway, pausing by the front door, confused. That confusion would spread into panic. And then too late into dread. When my flight was called, I rose and walked down the boarding tunnel with the stillness of someone stepping over a threshold. Inside the plane, I took my seat and stared straight ahead. The safety demonstration blurred into background noise. As the engines rumbled and the runway began to fall away beneath us, I felt gravity tighten around my chest. Then release. Hours later, we landed in Iceland. Cold air, foreign accents, a long layover that worked in my favor. I used the downtime to stretch, hydrate, and breathe. I sent a scheduled email to a storage locker company in Paris, confirming access for a set of packages I had arranged in advance. I never used Wi-Fi. I left no trail. When it was time to board again, I stepped onto the connecting flight with the calm of someone erasing footprints. Paris arrived in a rush of light rain and gray skies. The hostel I had booked in Montmartre was modest. A narrow bed, a small shared bathroom, and a radiator that clanged at night. But it was safe. It was mine. I sat on the bed with my bag beside me and let the silence settle. This was not a vacation. Not a fantasy. I had less than $17,000, no job, no support system, and a command of French that extended no further than asking for water and directions. But I was no longer trapped. I moved through the next 2 days with precision. I purchased a second burner phone locally. I registered for a language exchange event using my alias. I visited a small cafe and paid cash for a weekly sandwich special. I listened, observed, absorbed. My accent marked me as foreign. My eyes stayed alert. I kept my answers vague, my back always to the wall. Each step was small, but each step mattered. For the first time in years, I was the only one steering the wheel. On the third day, I folded away my American documents, placed them at the back of a locked drawer, and opened a fresh notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote just 2 words. Begin again. From that moment on, I stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about how to build something no one could take away from me. On the cracked windowsill of that cramped little room, with the sound of church bells echoing from down the hill, I looked out at a city that didn't know me, didn't expect anything from me. And that, more than anything, was freedom. From here, Paris would become the place where I would learn how to live, on my terms. The morning light in Paris was thin and gray, soft enough to make everything look like a watercolor. I stood outside the employment agency on Rue de Clichy, clutching my folder of forged paperwork, every page curated to reveal just enough, and hide the rest. My name, Emily Carter. My experience, vague but believable. I had chosen every word on my resume to create a version of myself that sounded safe, simple, and forgettable. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of old coffee and damp wool. The receptionist barely glanced at me as she handed over a clipboard. I filled in the blanks slowly, pretending I had done this 1,000 times before. My hands didn't shake, but they felt numb. When my name was called, mangled into something like Emily Carter, I stood and followed the voice down a narrow hallway to a small office lined with gray filing cabinets. The woman behind the desk was stiff and efficient, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her blouse crisply ironed. "Your French is minimal," she noted without looking up. "I'm learning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Quickly. She looked at me properly then. Not impressed but interested. "Experience?" she asked. "Administrative," I answered. "I'm organized. Punctual. I learn fast." It wasn't a lie, just an edited version of the truth. She sighed. "There's one position. Receptionist. Lambert Financial. 3-month contract. English required for international clients." My heart thumped once, hard. "When can I start?" 2 days later, I walked into a modest office on the 3rd floor of a building in the 8th arrondissement. It was clean, structured, and quiet. 15 employees, mostly French, mostly well-dressed and brisk. My desk was near the entrance, a small fortress of polished wood. A fresh start. "Bonjour, Lambert Financial," I practiced under my breath before the doors opened. The French sounded strange on my tongue, unfamiliar and awkward. But I said it anyway. Again and again. That first week I made mistakes. I answered phones with a stammer. Mispronounced names. Misunderstood requests. Giselle, my direct supervisor, was not subtle in her disapproval. She viewed me like a stain on the edge of an otherwise clean napkin. But she didn't complain out loud. That was something. I arrived early every day and stayed late whenever I could. I memorized employee names, internal extension codes, floor plans. At night, I attended free language exchanges at a small bookstore near Pigalle, where expats and locals practiced sentences over tea and stale cookies. I never told anyone where I was from. When asked, I simply smiled and said, "Just somewhere else." On the 3rd Friday, Giselle caught me butchering a client's name over the phone. She winced audibly. I apologized. "Let me help you," she said, surprising both of us. During lunch breaks, she began correcting my grammar in small, almost reluctant doses. In return, I stayed behind to help her format English reports. Over time, she stopped calling me the American. She began calling me Emily. My tiny studio apartment, rented from a landlord who only accepted cash, became my sanctuary. It had a window the size of a suitcase and a bed that creaked with every shift, but it was mine. Each evening, I sat at a rickety desk and wrote down every new French word I had learned that day. I repeated them aloud like mantras. The language became armor. Each phrase, each verb conjugation, a barrier between the woman I had been and the one I was building. One afternoon, while sorting incoming mail, I noticed 2 invoices with identical numbers. At first, I assumed it was a mistake in the scanning system. Then I checked the payments. Both had been processed. Nearly 40,000 euros duplicated. My stomach twisted. I hovered over the folder, unsure if it was my place to say anything. But silence, I'd learned, was often the language of the powerless. I knocked on the glass door of Philippe Lambert's office, heart racing. He looked up, wildly surprised to see the receptionist. I explained what I had found. His expression shifted from mild irritation to sharp interest. "Show me." I laid out the documents. He was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "You have good eyes," he said. The next morning an email was waiting in my inbox. Effective immediately, my role would shift from receptionist to administrative assistant. Higher clearance, more responsibilities, closer access to internal operations. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a signal. Paris was no longer just the place I ran to. It was the ground on which I would rise. From here, as I began to understand numbers like language, and systems like stories, I saw the outlines of a path I hadn't dared imagine before. And in that quiet realization I finally started to believe. While my past had taught me pain, this city would teach me power. The elevator dinged softly as I stepped onto the third floor, my badge newly updated with the words, "Administrative Assistant." It was printed in bold, but all I could hear in my mind was, "You belong here." A small desk had been prepared near the accounting department, positioned between the internal mail shelves and a glass partition that gave a partial view of the executive offices. From this new vantage point I was no longer invisible. Not quite seen yet, but no longer furniture. My duties were varied. Data entry, scheduling, internal filing, processing correspondence. Mundane tasks to most, but I devoured them. Each report, each spreadsheet, was a language I understood better than any French verb chart. Numbers had a rhythm. They made sense in ways that people didn't. I noticed patterns before others did. Discrepancies. Trends. Inconsistencies. I never said a word unless I was certain. One afternoon, as I was organizing quarterly reports for a client meeting, I noticed something. A large investment summary for a telecom strategy outlined substantial allocations toward a sector I had flagged earlier as unstable. Labor unrest. Pending EU regulations. Red flags. It wasn't my place to challenge strategy. But something about this plan didn't sit right. I hesitated, walked away from the file, then circled back an hour later and read it again. Oh, I wasn't wrong. I stood outside Philippe Lambert's office for a full minute before knocking. Inside, the senior team was preparing for a high-profile client presentation. My heart thudded against my ribs as I interrupted, apologizing softly, and placed a single blue folder on the table. "There's updated information in this report," I said quietly. 3 major telecom providers in Europe are under regulatory review. The timing of this recommendation might present a risk. I gave them the exact location of the report where it had been filed and then excused myself, trying not to look too shaken. I waited the rest of the day for a reprimand. It never came. That evening I was summoned to Philippe's office again. He didn't mince words. "You read all of our reports?" I nodded. "Sir. I find them educational." He studied me for a long time before speaking again. "What do you know about financial markets?" I exhaled. "More than a receptionist should. Less than I want to." He sat back in his chair, quiet. "Your observations saved us from a misstep. Would you be open to more responsibility?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." From that point forward, I was looped into internal research teams, given data sets to summarize, and allowed to shadow some of the junior analysts. I still spoke little. But I watched. I listened. I absorbed. In the evenings, I cross-referenced economic patterns with regional legislation. I subscribed to newsletters no one else read. I taught myself through repetition and intuition. Philippe stopped treating me like an anomaly. He started treating me like a quiet asset. My days grew longer, but I didn't mind. I started carrying a slim notebook everywhere, jotting down thoughts between meetings on the train while waiting for coffee. I noticed that my French improved fastest in context, so I began translating business terms aloud to myself. At home, my walls were covered in sticky notes. Verbs, formulas, legal terms. I whispered them as I made tea. I recited them while folding laundry. Each one a step closer to fluency. Each one another layer of armor. Occasionally, I would wake in the middle of the night with a cold sweat. In those moments, I wasn't Emily Carter. I was Emma Reynolds again, lying next to a man who had plotted to abandon her, the echo of laughter ringing in her ears. But the walls of my Paris apartment weren't thin enough for ghosts. I pressed my palm to my chest until my breath slowed, then returned to sleep. I never let those nights bleed into the morning. Months passed. My role evolved. I was now analyzing data for client portfolios, writing summaries that were circulated in internal briefings. I was no longer hiding. I was building. And then came the rainy Tuesday that would change everything. The office was quiet, dampened by the storm outside. I was preparing the conference room for a meeting, arranging water glasses and printed agendas. Philippe entered with 2 senior advisors and glanced at me. "Emily, could you bring the Mercer portfolio when you have a moment?" I nodded and retrieved it from the file cabinet. As I placed it on the table, something in the documents caught my attention. The investment recommendation didn't match current data. It leaned heavily into a sector I knew was facing mounting risk. I paused, hand on the door. I could walk away. Say nothing. Stay in my lane. Pardon, I said, turning. I couldn't help noticing your telecom allocation. There was a report last week highlighting significant regulatory delays in 3 key markets. That timing might be problematic. Silence fell. No one spoke. Then Philippe leaned forward. "Where is this report?" I answered without hesitation. "Third cabinet, second drawer. Blue folder." He turned to retrieve it himself. I stood in the hallway afterward, pulse racing. No one said anything directly. But later that day, a new access badge was placed on my desk. From this point on, I was no longer just rebuilding. I was ascending. And the future, though I couldn't have known it, was about to introduce me to someone whose decisions carried weight across continents. The first time I met Tanner Reed, I didn't know who he was. Not exactly. I was called into Philippe Lambert's office without warning. When I entered, a tall man in a navy suit was seated across from him, back straight, hands folded, every inch of him calibrated for control. Philippe stood and gestured between us. "Emily, this is Mr. Tanner Reed, CEO of Atlantic Meridian Shipping. Mr. Reed, this is Emily Carter, the analyst I mentioned." Tanner stood to shake my hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. His eyes, clear blue, steady, searched my face with quiet curiosity. "Mr. Lambert tells me you have a talent for spotting trends others overlook," he said, voice smooth, unmistakably American. I smiled politely. "I just pay attention to details." "So do I," he replied. The moment settled between us like a held breath. That meeting was brief. Tanner was considering expanding his company's European holdings and wanted insight on regulatory stability and labor markets. I was assigned to compile a full review of the current landscape. It was by far the largest account I'd been handed. I worked in near silence over the next 2 weeks, reviewing dozens of reports, translating legislation, plotting trends, building scenarios. Tanner returned often. He preferred quiet meetings, sometimes one-on-one, asking sharp, precise questions. I learned quickly that his calm demeanor masked a mind that moved fast. He didn't bluff. He didn't posture. He evaluated risk like a surgeon, cold, clean, efficient. I respected him immediately. Took longer to like him. But that came too. One afternoon he flipped through a report I'd written and paused. "You've flagged our Mediterranean ports as high risk," he noted, not defensive, just curious. "Most analysts consider the region stable." "Most analysts aren't tracking union activity across Palermo, Marseille, and Valencia," I answered. 3 major strikes in 8 months. A 4th is brewing. New fuel emissions regulations are also going into effect next quarter. Operational costs will spike at least 17%. He nodded slowly, eyes locked on mine. "Your recommendation? Shift resources north. The Norwegian corridor offers lower volatility and better short-term returns." He closed the file without a word. 2 weeks later, the Mediterranean ports erupted in the largest shipping strike in 15 years. Atlantic Meridian, having already shifted assets, absorbed the shock without pause. Their competitors bled millions. The next morning, Tanner arrived at the office again. He didn't ask for a briefing. He asked for me. In Philippe's office, he spoke directly. "I'd like to borrow Miss Carter for a project, consulting between our firms. She'd serve as liaison. 2 days a week to start." Philippe hesitated, but Tanner named a figure that made any resistance evaporate. And just like that, I entered a new orbit. Tanner's Paris apartment was where we worked most often. It wasn't ostentatious. It was deliberate. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the Eiffel Tower, everything in its place. We sat across from each other at a long walnut table, laptops open, spreadsheets glowing. Hours passed without much small talk. He never asked personal questions. Neither did I. But we talked about everything else. Supply chains, fuel futures, shipping regulations, foreign markets. He tested my logic. I challenged his assumptions. There was no performance between us. Only precision. Over time a rhythm formed. I anticipated his questions before he asked them. He began referencing my opinions in executive decisions. I began offering analysis without invitation. One night as we worked late, he leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. Most people operate in reaction mode. You don't. I glanced up. Reaction is expensive, I said. And often too late. He smiled faintly. Exactly. Then came the crash. It started with a major Asian bank collapsing, then a domino effect. Global markets teetered. Panic selling took hold. Tanner called me during the first tremor. Everyone's liquidating, he said, voice clipped. The board wants to follow. I didn't hesitate. Don't. This is when we acquire, not retreat. There was a beat of silence. You're asking me to bet the company. I'm asking you to see what we prepared for. 3 days later, while competitors burned assets in fire sales, Atlantic Meridian moved quietly. They acquired underpriced routes, absorbed smaller firms, and doubled their fleet for a fraction of its original value. 6 months later, Tanner's company had tripled in market value. Financial publications called it genius. Only we knew it was execution. After the crisis settled, things shifted. He invited me to dinner after a long meeting. We talked about books. Music. I learned he had a daughter in college, rarely called. A marriage that had ended years ago, not with drama, but distance. He asked if I'd ever been married. Once, I said. A long time ago. We didn't discuss it further. One evening, after a particularly successful merger, he opened a bottle of champagne in his apartment. To unlikely partnerships, he toasted. To new beginnings, I countered. Our glasses touched. His eyes lingered on mine. Emily, he said softly, I value more than just your insight. I set my glass down carefully. Tanner. I work for you. Technically you work for Lambert, he said. But I understand. We didn't revisit the topic for months. Our rhythm resumed. Steady. Professional. But the line had shifted. And we both knew it. Still, love was not yet the story. We were strategists. Builders. But the foundation had been poured. And what neither of us could predict was that my greatest test, the one that would define everything, was now slowly turning its eyes toward me. The courthouse was small, tucked between an art gallery and a flower shop in the quiet heart of Paris's 7th arrondissement. No velvet aisle. No string quartet. No lace veil. Just a single afternoon in October, 2 signatures and a simple pair of rings. Tanner stood beside me in a charcoal suit, his hand steady in mine as we said our vows in front of Philippe and his wife, the only witnesses to a ceremony neither of us wanted to make a spectacle of. I wore a soft ivory dress, no train, no embellishments, just simplicity and choice. It wasn't about pageantry. It was about truth. Afterward, we walked hand in hand through the early evening, the Seine sparkling in the fading light. It didn't feel like I had gained a title. It felt like I had claimed a space that no one else could define for me. I wasn't becoming someone's wife. I was choosing to build a life, on equal footing, with someone who saw me not as a trophy, not as a burden, but as a mind, a force, a presence. Our home, now officially ours, looked out over the city. The windows opened wide to the world. In the mornings, Tanner read the paper and brewed coffee. I worked through market reports at the kitchen table. It was quiet, methodical, comforting. At night we talked. Not always deeply. Not always seriously. But consistently. We shared books, music, patterns of thought. There was no mask. No need to perform. Professionally, little changed on the surface. I maintained my position at Lambert Financial, though most of my time was now spent consulting on Tanner's international ventures. We traveled often. Zurich, Copenhagen, Singapore. Never quite tourists, never quite residents. My name now appeared discreetly in memos, board briefings, legal reviews. I didn't need headlines. I had influence. But sometimes, in the middle of a quiet night, I would wake up gasping, heart racing, the echo of gravel underfoot, of laughter fading into distance, crashing back like a wave. In those moments, Tanner would reach for me without asking. His hand on my back. His breath steady beside mine. I never explained the dreams. He never pushed for details. But in the silence, I knew he understood that healing wasn't a destination. It was a rhythm. And though I wore a new ring on my finger, a twisted band of imperfect gold, designed by a local artisan Tanner admired, it didn't erase the old scars. It didn't pretend they never happened. It simply said, "This is mine now." All of it. Still, the past had a way of whispering. One morning over coffee, Tanner shared a newspaper article about a recent corporate scandal in the U.S. I skimmed it, heart thudding, though the name Reynolds appeared nowhere. But it was enough to bring the memory forward. Jack's voice. Phoebe's laugh. The suffocating numbness of smiling through betrayal. Later that day, as I walked through the corridors of Lambert Financial, I caught my reflection in the glass. Tailored suit. Straight posture. Calm gaze. A woman whose life was no longer built around hiding. I had spent years believing that survival was the goal. That escape was enough. But I was beginning to see something else. I had the right to more than escape. I had the right to thrive. That realization became the foundation for how I moved through the world. I began mentoring 2 younger analysts, both women from immigrant families who reminded me of myself. I shared frameworks, offered quiet guidance, nothing grand. Just steady presence. I knew what it was to feel small in rooms built to exclude you. I knew how valuable even one voice could be. Tanner and I didn't define ourselves by public measures. No anniversary announcements. No photo spreads. But every time he introduced me as his partner, to clients, to board members, to old friends, I felt a quiet pride. Not because of the title, but because it was the truth. Sometimes we talked about what might have been if we'd met sooner. He would ask, "Do you ever wish we'd crossed paths earlier?" And I'd smile gently. "If you had met me then, I wouldn't have known who I was. You wouldn't have seen me clearly." We found each other when we were ready. We spent a spring weekend in Provence, away from screens and schedules, walking through lavender fields, eating meals without discussion of margins or risks. On the final night, Tanner took my hand and said, "No regrets." I looked at him, really looked, and replied, "None." "And you?" He kissed the back of my hand. "Only that I didn't find you sooner." But even that, we both knew, was just a romantic illusion. The truth was, this love didn't arrive to rescue me. It arrived because I rescued myself. And yet, just as life began to feel like something I could fully call mine, secure, steady, self-forged, an email notification on Tanner's laptop would appear. A name I hadn't heard in years. A name that once left me stranded in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly, the calm I had built so carefully would be tested in a way I had never expected. The notification blinked quietly at the corner of Tanner's screen. We were sitting in his Manhattan office, reviewing quarterly projections when he paused mid-sentence. His expression shifted, curious, unreadable. He tapped the message, opened it, then turned the monitor slightly toward me. "Something interesting just came in," he said. The email was from a financial intermediary seeking investment for a mid-sized American construction company, Reynolds Construction. The name hit me like a slow blade. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I simply stared at the name I hadn't seen written out in nearly 4 years. The company Jack had inherited. The one he had been running into the ground even before I left. "They're looking for international expansion," Tanner said, scanning. "Based in the Midwest. Overextended. No concrete overseas contracts, though they claim potential deals." He glanced up, sensing my stillness. "Emily." My voice came quiet. "Reynolds was my married name. Jack Reynolds is my ex-husband." Tanner didn't flinch. He leaned back slowly, waiting for me to continue. "He was the man I left, after the incident I mentioned. I had only ever spoken vaguely about it. An abandonment, a betrayal. But seeing that name in print pulled everything forward with brutal clarity. What do you want to do?" Tanner asked carefully. Part of me wanted nothing. To delete the message. To erase the possibility of his voice ever echoing in a room I occupied. But another part, one I hadn't heard from in years, rose quietly, steadily, with something more dangerous than vengeance. "Closure. Take the meeting," I said. "I want to be there. Not for revenge. but to see him. Once. On my terms. Tanner studied me for a long moment. Are you sure? I nodded. I'm not afraid of him anymore. The day of the meeting I dressed deliberately. A tailored charcoal suit, pearl earrings. Subtle, commanding. My hair pinned in a low twist, sleek and unmoving. I stood in front of the mirror in our New York apartment and stared at the reflection. No hesitation. No doubt. Tanner adjusted his tie beside me. Second thoughts, he asked. No, I said, meeting his gaze in the mirror. Just preparing. Atlantic Meridian's boardroom sat high above Midtown, glass walls wrapping around the city skyline. I sat at the table with my laptop open, back straight, my nameplate reading, Emily Carter Reed, Chief Strategic Advisor. I faced the window away from the door, giving no indication of who I was. Yet. They're here, Tanner's assistant said through the intercom. My fingers stilled over the keyboard, but I didn't look up. The door opened. I heard Tanner greet them politely, then another voice, rougher, familiar, lined with forced charm. Thanks for seeing us, Mr. Reed. I'm Jack Reynolds. This is my financial advisor, Marcus Clean. I didn't move. Let them sit. Let them begin. Jack started his pitch confidently, though his voice carried a hint of strain. He spoke about market reach, growth potential, international partners. I watched from the corner of my eye as he gestured toward charts, unaware of the bomb waiting across the table. When he finally paused to pass the discussion to Marcus, I raised my head. Recognition didn't hit instantly. His eyes passed over me, professional detachment, then narrowed, snapping back like a rubber band pulled too far. His mouth opened, then closed. Emma, he breathed. No, I said, voice smooth. Emily Reed, Chief Strategic Advisor for Atlantic Meridian. And Mr. Reed's wife. The silence that followed was complete. Marcus blinked. You two know each other? Jack looked utterly blindsided. We, knew each other. From before. Tanner remained neutral, polite. Small world. I slid the portfolio across the table. We've reviewed your proposal, I began. Unfortunately, your debt-to-asset ratio is unfavorable, and without confirmed international contracts, the risk profile is high. Page 4 outlines our concerns. My tone was clinical, factual, unshakable. Jack barely glanced at the report. You disappeared, he said suddenly, no longer pretending this was business. We filed a missing person report. The police searched. There was an investigation. I nodded. How unfortunate for you. 3 years, he said, his voice breaking. Not a word. Not a trace. We thought you were dead. And yet, I said, spreading my hands gently. Here I am. Alive. Successful. Married. Safe. I let the word linger. When the formal review concluded, Tanner suggested Marcus follow up with our finance team regarding documentation. That left the three of us, just Jack, Tanner, and me, in a room with too much silence. Why? Jack finally asked. His voice had dropped, strained and small. I looked him straight in the eye. Because you blindfolded me and left me at an abandoned gas station on my 35th birthday. Because I overheard you plotting to humiliate and discard me. Because I realized I deserved more than being the joke in your story. He looked gutted. It wasn't. Don't, I cut in, calm but final. Don't rewrite what you did. I didn't come here for apologies. I came to prove, to myself, that you no longer have any power over me. The truth of that statement settled over me like warm sunlight. It wasn't forgiveness. It was freedom. He stared at me, hollowed out. So that's it? 3 years of silence and now you're just someone else's wife. I'm my own person, I said quietly, who happened to marry someone who sees me. I stood, extending my hand like a closing signature. Goodbye, Jack. As he left the room, pale and silent, Tanner joined me by the window. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I exhaled fully for the first time in years. And in that moment I knew, the final tether to my old life had just been severed. Not with fire. Not with fury. But with quiet, unstoppable clarity. From here on there was nothing left to run from. Only a life fully my own to live. The Mediterranean shimmered beneath a cloudless sky as our yacht cut through gentle waves. Tanner stood at the helm, his sleeves rolled, sunglasses resting against the bridge of his nose. I leaned against the railing, the wind threading through my hair, eyes closed, the warmth of the sun pressed softly to my skin. This was not a vacation. It was a rhythm. A life shaped, honed, and earned through every step of my escape and every hour of rebuilding. 3 years had passed since that final encounter with Jack. The memory of him no longer hurt. It no longer echoed. It simply existed, contained, faded, irrelevant. He had come into that boardroom hoping for investment and walked out face to face with the woman he once tried to erase. But I hadn't destroyed him. I hadn't needed to. I had simply risen without him. Tanner and I had found a balance that few dared dream of, partners in every sense. We ran our ventures together now. Atlantic Meridian continued to grow steadily, our long-term strategy praised in business journals and quietly studied by competitors. I still consulted with Lambert Financial, though most of my time was spent advising Tanner directly. We moved fluidly between Paris and New York with occasional stops in Singapore or Zurich. Our lives lived in motion, not in chaos. But the most extraordinary thing about this chapter was its peace. No fanfare. No fireworks. Just mornings spent reading reports side by side, evenings walking along quiet shorelines, and the kind of mutual respect that never needed explanation. One crisp afternoon in Paris, I stood behind a podium at the Global Women in Finance conference. It was the first time I had shared my story publicly, not all of it, not the rawest parts, but enough. Enough for the room of women, eyes raised, breath held, to feel something shift. I didn't talk about victimhood. I spoke about design. About architecture. About what it means to build a life with intent rather than inherit one by default. Afterward, a young woman approached me, her voice trembling. "How did you keep going?" she asked. I answered honestly. By deciding that the pain would not be the ending. Only the beginning of a better version of me. She nodded. I could see the recognition in her eyes, the same flicker I once saw in my own reflection, back when hope felt too fragile to say aloud. Tanner watched me from across the room that evening, pride softened by humility. We never celebrated with noise. We celebrated with quiet toasts on balconies, with eyes that spoke more than any applause could. A week later, as we reviewed a series of acquisition prospects over coffee, he reached across the table and stilled my hand. "You've been different lately," he said gently. "Not restless. Just lighter." I smiled. "I think I finally believe it's real. That this isn't borrowed. It's mine." He nodded, understanding without needing me to explain. That night, standing on the balcony of our Paris apartment, he wrapped his arms around me from behind. The city glittered, alive but distant. "Any regrets, Mrs. Reed?" he asked softly. I turned my face toward his. "None," I said. "And you?" He kissed the edge of my jaw. "Only that I didn't meet you sooner." I smiled at that, not with nostalgia but with certainty. If you'd met me sooner, I wouldn't have been ready. In another life, Jack might have seen me as a burden. In this one, Tanner saw me as a compass. As a strategist. As a woman who had turned ash into foundation. He respected what I had lost, but he loved who I had become. As the seasons passed, we continued building. Not empires but a life. One defined by thoughtfulness, by care, by the absence of noise. I no longer felt the need to prove anything. Not to Jack. Not to the world. And not even to myself. Because this life, the quiet mornings, the calm control, the laughter over late dinners, was not a reaction to betrayal. It was not vengeance dressed in gold. It was something deeper. Something slower. A deliberate act of self-respect, renewed every single day. I had not needed to ruin Jack to feel whole. I had only needed to remove his name from the architecture of my future. And as I stood at the bow of our yacht, watching the horizon stretch into the soft gold of evening, I knew with absolute clarity that my story had no cliffhanger. No sequel. No lingering rage. Only this. A woman. Whole. Unapologetic. Unbroken. Not forged by the fire. But by the way she chose to rise from it. And so Emma's journey, no Emily's journey, comes to a quiet, powerful close. Not with revenge. Not with spectacle. But with choice. Her strength wasn't in how she escaped, but in how she rebuilt, brick by brick, decision by decision, until her life no longer resembled the ashes she walked away from. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound victories are not loud. They're lived. Have you ever walked away from something, or someone, not to destroy them but to rediscover yourself? I'd love to hear what part of Emily's story spoke to you most. If her story moved you, if you felt seen in her silence or inspired by her strength, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories of quiet resilience and bold reinvention. Your support helps us bring more voices like hers into the light.